ready to go!
You're listening to By Land and by Sea, powered by the Maritime Professor. So remember the $45 million FMC case we talked about last week? Bed Bath & Beyond versus OOCL? Minimum quantity commitment, all of that, right? Well, they walked in and said, you know what, let's talk about the Constitution instead. This case just got a whole lot more interesting. We're going to break it down today. Hi, welcome back to By Land and by Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Beagen, founder of the Maritime Professor, former FMC International Affairs attorney, and founder of Squall Strategies. By Land and by Sea is your go-to resource for navigating the regulatory side of global ocean shipping. And well, me, I'm your favorite maritime attorney, aren't I? As always, this podcast for educational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. There is no attorney-client privilege created by this video or this podcast. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So let's get into it because, as you know, ocean shipping moves the world. All right, well, let's hop right into it. Bed Bath & Beyond, BBBY versus OOCL. This is minimum quantity commitments. This is what we talked about last week, at least in part. We talked about the Evergreen case, $512 detention demurrage. That was a win for the incentive principle. Bed Bath & Beyond versus OOCL. This one was all about minimum quantity commitments, right? It caught my attention because there's been a whole slew of cases that have really kind of tried to get at the idea of what does my service contract actually get me? And from both sides. And I think it's a good question because what happens, right? You have a certain amount of freight that's committed. So that's the minimum quantity commitment for a perhaps reduced freight rate. Committed cargo. The question kind of is, if you committed cargo and the carrier committed space, and you have a minimum quantity commitment, what happens when the market gets tight? And that's kind of what's the center of this case and many others. So Bed Bath & Beyond brought the claims to the FMC against the OOCL. It was kind of tied to pandemic era service contracts. We're seeing a lot of that in a lot of these cases. A lot of them, as I said last week, are getting kind of decided on retaliatory behavior or something that's not exactly quite hitting at that minimum quantity commitment. This one felt like it was the first that really kind of edged into service contract enforceability and minimum quantity commitment enforceability. The FMC administrative law judge issued the initial decision, and we're actually still in the 22 days that this could be pulled for sua sponte review, meaning the FMC commissioners can decide to review this on their own accord. Or if within 22 days that doesn't happen, this becomes final and this becomes FMC decision. So let's break that down a little bit. The administrative law judge is the one who gets this first. The administrative law judge. That's where the complaints go into the FMC. So the FMC can kind of act like a court. We've talked about this a few times. They can kind of act like a court. They are a court. You bring your claim in, and if it's not a small claims, right? The Evergreen case that we talked about last week is a small claims, essentially $500 something. This one was much higher. Bed Bath & Beyond actually asked for, I think it was more than $160 million. So this one went into the formal complaints process under the FMC process, which goes to the administrative law judge first. So they go through the full court case. They go through all of the legal, procedural, administrative back and forth and discovery and all the things that go along with the case. And so the administrative law judge, and it was actually the chief administrative law judge, issued her initial decision and awarded no, it's still a wild number, but it was not 400. $45.6 million in reparations to OOCL. That's a giant award in the FMC world. I think the previous one was $32 million. Now we're up to $45.6 million. And again, this one mattered because this was hinging really more discussion and legal determination on that minimum quantity commitment, right? What enforceability, what kind of reality are these minimum quantity commitments? What is this agreement? It's such a practical issue for the industry. Now, because we're starting to edge into minimum quantity commitments with this case, I anticipate that we're going to see probably quite a few other cases start to shake free. Now, right, sometimes service contracts can feel a little bit like an annual process. The shipper forecasts cargo, carrier negotiates rates and space. Parties agree to a minimum quantity commitment. Contract gets filed, and that's what these service contracts do. They get filed at the FMC. Now, they're not a public document that you can just go look up, but the FMC monitors these because they want to make sure that there aren't any collusive behaviors, antitrust infringements happening. They want to make sure that everything and everyone is moving together fairly and efficiently. And so while they're not going over the specific rates, they are going over unfavorable shipping conditions, unfair or fair terms, just generally monitoring service contracts that come in. But here's where the question on a lot of these cases come in, and we just kind of said this. When the market gets tight, service contracts, that's what we're trying to figure out. Where is the enforceability of a service contract? Because a lot of the terms might be year over year, they might be month over month. But can you say, well, I was committed to 100 TEUs for the month of April, and you didn't perform? Okay, well, the month of April is a long time. Or even worse, right? If it's the entire year, say, well, I had a minimum quantity commitment of 10,000 TEUs for the year of 2021. Well, let's say 2,000, whatever, it doesn't matter. And these were my freight rates that we agreed to. But then the argument comes up, and this is it's a fair argument. It comes up, operationally, we can't fulfill it this week. We're going to have to push it to next week. We can't fulfill it this month because operationally it's not going to work. And so that's when you sometimes see the shippers getting pushed over into the spot market saying, look, we don't have commitments. We don't have space for minimum quantity commitments. But if you are interested, we could potentially get you on this other vessel or this other route. But you're going to have to pay spot market, which is kind of like current going rate. Now, the trouble is in 2020, 2021, right, those COVID congestion years, that's where we really saw a lot of the spot rate jumping up to $20,000 per shipment, right, for Asia to U.S. West Coast. Whereas the previous year, the service contract discussion or agreement, it might have been as low as 1,100 or 2,000 for that same route. So you go 2,000 minimum quantity commitment, preferential freight rate to a spot rate that might be pushing you into $20,000. So it's a significant jump. And so that's kind of what this case was all about, right? And I don't want to go too far down this line. I'm getting away from it. The point is, it was partially decided on that determination. And service contract enforceability and service contract kind of good faith is all of this kind of came, and retaliation and failure to deal and all of these things that the OOCL actually, Beth Beagen raised here were Shipping Act violations. Because the other piece that I think I might have casually mentioned quickly last week is that the FMC doesn't do breach of contract. The FMC was created under the Shipping Act for Shipping Act violatory type complaints. Just a breach of contract is not that. But enforceability or not fulfilling a service contract starts to get into that. And that's why these minimum quantity commitments are so interesting, because do they fall under the FMC's authorities? I think the answer is, for the most part, yes, because service contracts are filed with the FMC. But what if they're not enforced? What if they're not honored? That's where it starts to become a Shipping Act issue. And so the FMC is not general contract court. It's a Shipping Act, essentially, court. However, obviously, $46 million and the largest finding of penalties or reparations or a judgment against a company is probably going to be a big deal for that company. So this is where it gets really interesting. OOCL has filed a separate lawsuit, and they actually filed it in federal court in Texas. Now, they're not necessarily filing it saying we disagree with the ruling on service contract and the enforceability, but they're challenging the constitutional structure of the FMC's administrative law judge process. So what does that mean? OOCL is saying that the FMC's administrative law judges are too insulated from presidential control, or just generally too insulated. Now, this is getting very niche-y, very specific. Let me make sure that we're all on the same page, right? Administrative law judge. That is where these complaints come into the FMC. They're special judges, administrative law judges. And this is not unique to the FMC. This is something that many independent regulatory agencies have. ALJs are out there all over the place. And the FMC has ALJs as well. Now, they have for-cause removal protections, and that runs through a separate entity, which is the Merit System Protection Board. Members also have removal protections. And so what essentially, and I don't want to go too far down this line, but OOCL is saying, look, that's creating way too much insulation for these ultimate determiners, the administrative law judges. It's a very technical legal argument, but it's connecting this maritime case to an actually larger conversation that has been happening pretty much since this administration came into authority, and I think probably beyond that, but certainly something that we saw under Trump too, right? The Trump second administration. When they first came in, they raised some questions, and broader questions, not FMC specific, but broader questions about independent regulatory agencies and kind of their insulation or how they interact with the executive branch, right? Because we have the three branches of government. So it's not necessarily OOCL going after the FMC specifically, but it's more of a, like I said, constitutional question, independent agencies more broadly. And it's kind of supported by the Department of Justice also taking some of these questions up in recent years of removal protections for ALJs and whether they're constitutional or not. So that's what's being brought up here. And that's why this case has become much larger, right? I think we are still going to continue to see a lot of cases talk about minimum quantity commitments. We still have the 22 days of this case going from initial decision to final decision. But in the meantime, the FMC's administrative process is being challenged. But it's not just the FMC, it's generally, right? So I think that this is important for really anybody that's a shipper or an importer or an exporter or a BCO or kind of anybody in the overall supply chain system, carriers, NVOs. I think everybody needs to watch this because not only are these minimum quantity commitments beginning movement into some sort of, I guess, guidance, I would say, legal guidance, right? I mean, case law, precedents, but really kind of guidance is what we're starting to see. I think we're going to see very case specific, very, very fine-tuned to that specific instance information coming out of these cases on minimum quantity commitments and performance and space allocation. But the larger question here is talking about administrative law judges and whether they're constitutional. And what an interesting time to bring that conversation. It's very possible, and I guess why I'm kind of pausing here is it's very possible that the FMC, this could be something that raises all the way to the Supreme Court. I don't know if it will, and it's not even an FMC specific thing. This is something these administrative law judges are at a lot of agencies. But it's an interesting question on how much authority does the FMC have to decide these disputes through its administrative process, and how insulated are the ALJs from any sort of overview, removal authority? I mean, all of these things, right? All of these things come into question. And so you already have independent regulatory agencies as kind of a sub piece of the executive branch. And then now the argument or the discussion here that will now happen is, what about the ALJs already in this kind of funky independent regulatory agency world? This is going to be interesting. We'll see what the Texas court has to say about this. I mean, the minimum quantity commitments was already interesting. The $46 million was interesting. And now all of a sudden OOCL says, you know what, to make it even more interesting, let's call into question the constitutionality of administrative law judges presiding over these types of issues. I'm going to obviously keep watching this one. I wanted to bring it to your attention because this one I actually hadn't seen much conversation about. This just happened this week, and the initial decision had happened last week. I hadn't seen much discussion about this one, and I wanted to make sure that you all are watching this with as nerdy legal interest as I am. So I'll obviously keep you updated. I'm going to continue to watch it. The other thing that I wanted to bring up, and this is just kind of a short little episode today. I was actually in DC, and for many of you, you may or may not know, I don't live in DC. I used to work for the Federal Maritime Commission, as you know, and a few other federal agencies. But I don't live there anymore, and yet I still stay just as interested in all things DC. But I was there this week. I go pretty regularly, and I was able to actually catch the International Propeller Club holding its salute to Congress. It's an event that happens over in the Virginia side. So anybody familiar with the DC area, DMV district, Maryland, Virginia, it was over in the Virginia side. I just want to say, whenever we have events like this, it feels like a maritime high school reunion in the best way for me. But what a great event. What a fantastic event. We had former colleagues of the FMC, many FMCers, new and old, industry friends, port people, policy people, industry association people, government folks. Look, people that I've worked with directly and people that I've known just through the maritime world. It feels like, and I know that this sounds trite and played out, but it felt like a family reunion of sorts. But it's just such a wonderful time going back to DC. But this was a really interesting night because it was honoring Congressman Salud Carvajal. He's a Democrat from California, and he's also been so focused on helping to promote and pursue and expand maritime and this maritime dominance conversation. It was really interesting hearing his remarks and on the acceptance of this honor. But one line that really stuck out for me was actually the keynote, and it was Stamatis Tsantanis. He's the chairman and CEO of Seanergy, so S-E-A Energy, so like energy, but C, Maritime Holdings Corporation, and the founder and chairman and CEO of the United Maritime Corporation. Now, he said, and I actually wrote this down in my iPhone notes, the sea is not a border. It is the extension of the homeland. And I mean, just kind of casually listening, it's, oh, yeah, of course. The sea is not a border. If you think of a map, right? You kind of like everything domestic. If you just kind of stay in that domestic mindset, everything inside, right, is the water is the delineating line. But the sea is not a border. It's the extension of the homeland. I loved it because the coastline is not where things end. The sea is not the edge of the map. And I think that's what he was getting across. That's where the opportunity continues. I won't even say begins, continues. We have the domestic economy, but that's not it. That's not it. That's not all, right? Commerce moves, supply chains connect. National strategy becomes real, and the economy reaches out to the rest of the world. That happens everywhere around the world. But just hearing him say that in a room full of maritime people anyways, the sea is not the border, it's the extension of the homeland. It just really kind of connected something for me that, look, maritime is that important. And I hope that message continues on to Congress, and I hope that we continue to have conversations about the Ships for America Act, about all of the initiatives that we have going on for everything maritime. We got to keep moving on this, right? We've been about a year since we had that executive order of April 9th, talking about the maritime dominance and the return to maritime dominance. We've now had the Maritime Action Plan, or at least the parameters and the beginnings of it, for quite a while, I should say, about 2 months, maybe 3 months, or maybe not even that long. And I'm loving that we have $500,000 going out in PIDP grants, so the Port Infrastructure Development Program grants. That's infrastructure that our ports desperately need. But it's got to be more, right? It's got to be more. We also, the small shipyard grants, those got to be more, right? We need more money to get these things going. And I love that I keep hearing from this administration, or should I say from Steve Carmel and Sang-Yi, I love that I keep hearing that cargo has got to be the driver here. And I think it's really interesting too, because only because I mentioned him, Deputy Maritime Administrator took a fantastic opportunity and is now the CEO of the American Association of Port Authorities, which I think is a wonderful way of having some of this government movement and some of this port development intersect. So look, this was a nerdy, policy-heavy, ocean shipping-focused community and an ocean shipping-focused night. It was an incredible way to reconnect with friends, and I'm so fortunate that it just happened to work out that I was able to stick around and take the late flight home. But you know what? It was so fun to just come back home to DC, catching up with all my favorite, what felt like classmates, right? It felt like a high school reunion. We're all getting there, right? This is such an exciting time. And I think that the thing that I said more and more and heard more and more throughout the entire night was what an incredible once in a lifetime moment we are in right now with Maritime. Now, let's not let this moment pass. Let's continue to push forward. Let's keep moving for maritime dominance and rebuilding the U.S. maritime personality. I mean, character. Just we got to rebuild it. We got to get there, right? So that's it for this week. A case that started as a minimum quantity commitment and service contract fight is also testing bigger questions about FMC authority, agency adjudication, and how far these Shipping Act cases can go. For importers, exporters, carriers, and VOCCs, the whole gamut, anybody in the ocean shipping world, even drayage providers, everybody that touches anything that goes ocean shipping, you got to watch this one. And really anybody that has anything to do with independent regulatory agencies. I mean, we're talking FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory. We're talking Securities and Exchange. We're talking any of these independent regulatory agencies that have ALJs. This is one to keep on your radar. If you like this episode, be sure to follow, subscribe, and leave a review. Want to go deeper on these topics or bring this kind of insight to your team? Visit themaritimeprofessor.com to explore corporate trainings, tailored briefings, and on-demand webinars, all designed to make complex maritime regulations practical and easy to understand. And if your organization needs help navigating the legal or strategic side of ocean shipping regs, head over to Squall Strategies. That's where I provide consulting services, regulatory guidance, and policy support for clients working across the supply chain. As always, this podcast for educational purposes only and not legal advice. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So until next time, I'm Lauren Beagen, the Maritime Professor, and you just listen to By Land and By Sea. See you next time.